Hi, welcome to another episode of GM Musings. My name is Alex, and today we will be talking about maps, how to create them and what put onto them. Now, maps are, in my opinion, one of the most important things, one of the most important ingredients for a good fantasy setting. Why? Well, mainly because nearly every single fantasy story out there, including your role-playing campaign, including my role-playing campaign, is in the end a story of exploration. People wish to see what is beyond the horizon. They wish to experience new NPCs. They to fight new monsters, to find new treasures and magical items, and explore old ruins, discover what hides within them, abandoned mines, or just new cities, new NPCs, maybe new realms, new whole continents, if you so wish. And because every fantasy story is a story of exploration, maps are important because every explorer needs a good map. Now, maps can do a lot of things for your fantasy setting. Firstly, they can make your heroes, your players, very excited, and they can awaken wanderlust within them, to use a German word, which basically means they draw them to become interested in going out there, experiencing the world that you have created. When they see a map with all those exotic names, cool cities, and their imagination is already running wild, ideally, and they might be thinking about, oh, what could be hiding behind this name? Oh, Shadow Fort, why is it called that? And depending on what names you use, names can be very important. The shape of a name can be very important to a setting. Now, what names can also do is draw your players deeper into the world, to inspire them to think, as I said, about things within your world. And maybe most importantly, they help with the suspension of disbelief that most players struggle with a little bit, because they hint at things that lie beyond the current area that the player characters are in, beyond their current horizon, so to speak. If you look at a map, you see cities, you see kingdoms that you have never seen before, and that will create the illusion that your world is a real world, a living, breathing place that moves and evolves and happens, no matter if the player characters happen to be nearby or not. It tells the player characters, hey, there's more things to be seen and more things happening at this very moment than just the current scene, that just the life in that little town that you are at the moment. Now, this video is not so much about what program to use to create a map. There are several programs that I have seen used to quite some significance, with some significant skill, and people have used them to create very impressive maps. GIMP and Photoshop, for those of you and us who are better suited to work with software, I guess, more complex programs and want to spend more time. A lot of people draw their maps by hand if they're more artistically inclined. If you're like me and you don't have a lot of software skills and you don't have many artistic skills when it comes to drawing either, I can recommend you Incarnate, which is a browser-based map editor. You need to make an account there, but it is free and you can use it. I've been using it for about 2 years, and I will put a link in the description below the video so you can click on it. I can heavily recommend it. It's very simple to learn, and with a minimal effort you can create fairly decently looking maps there. As I said, we're not talking about these programs in these videos. It's more about what to put onto your map and where to start when you start drawing a map. There is a few rules that I will tell you that you might or might not want to follow. Some of you will say, rules? Why would I need rules for geography and these things? It's a fantasy world. I can go batshit crazy with all the crazy magic, and I can create whatever I want because magic, right? Yes, you can do that, but I personally find that it is a good idea to create a degree of realism in your world. Firstly, because it makes it easier for the heroes to understand the world and to connect to it on a more emotional level. But secondly, also because contrasts are very important in life and in storytelling. And if you put a lot of realistic things onto your maps and into your worlds, the contrast to that will make your magical things, your fantastic things, even more magical and seem even more fantastic. Now, let's go through the steps. And you can generally change all these steps with magic, influence them, as I said before. There is basically two different ways to approach designing a map and designing a world as such in combination with the map. Either you start with creating all your realms. Maybe you already have a couple kingdoms and their NPCs therein created and you want to use them even before you started drawing a map. And then you draw the map around them. Say, for instance, one of your kingdoms is a kingdom like the Dothraki, say, for instance, in A Song of Ice and Fire or Game of Thrones, however you want to call it, which are Mongolian-inspired horse riders, a horse culture, heavily influenced by cavalry and a certain landscape that goes with that. So if you have a culture like the Dothraki in your world, you might want to add a large savanna or steppe like grasslands, basically, because horses need grasslands to run. It is their natural environment, and people who rely heavily on horses will be coming from such an environment, most likely. Or maybe you have a civilization of traders and merchants and sailors. For that, you will have to add a long, swooping coastline to your map, of course, and put that realm there. So that's one way to create the map. The other way, the one I prefer generally, is you make your geography and then you create your realms. If you do that, that of course means you have to create many different types of geography on your map, so it doesn't restrict you too much when you're creating realms. If you want to create a Viking-like realm in the frozen north, you have to put a frozen north onto your map, for instance, for that to work. Otherwise, it's a bit tricky, or a desert tribe cannot work without a desert. So, put some frozen bits, maybe some jungle, grasslands, forests, mountains, whatever, and maybe a little bit of desert as well on your map. Now, below the video, you will also find links to several maps that I have created. When I say several maps, I really only mean one map. It's the map of a continent that I would like to call the Broken Hand, because it kind of looks a little like a slightly mangled hand, I guess. This continent, the images you will see below, which I have created with Incarnate, by the way, so that's a bit of an example of what you can do with the program, is in different steps of creation. If you look at the first image, you will see rivers. Second one, you will see mountains. Then you will see climate zones, and so on and so on and so on, as I have progressively saved and downloaded the map to show it to you as I am creating it. So let's talk about mountains and rivers. Those are the two things, or except for a coastline, I guess, that you should put down onto your map first. With which ones you start is really not very important. I generally prefer to start with rivers, but rivers and mountains are very closely connected, because rivers come from mountains and run to the ocean, which is one of the main rules that you should be following in your world when it comes to rivers. A river does not run from a plains to a forest and then stops. That is very unlikely, unless, of course, there is a magical effect. Anyway, so let's talk about rivers first, as we have already started talking about them. I think rivers are the most important thing on your map. Why? Because water, transportation, fish, drinking water, water for agriculture, life, basically. If you think about our world, nearly every single one of the large cities in our world is situated close to or at a river. Rome has the Tiber. London has the Thames. Paris has the Seine. The Euphrates and Tigris, the two Mesopotamian rivers, created life, or civilization, I should say. The Nile. Without the Nile, Egypt would not have come into existence. So in your world, you will also have to think about where you want civilizations to be on the map. So if you want a civilization in a specific corner, put a river there. Now, there's not too many rules you have to follow about rivers, except for, as I said, they flow downhill, usually from the mountains, or at least hills, towards the coast, and then they enter into the coast. They might run together, so 2 or 3 smaller rivers might form a larger one, and that river will usually run all the way to the ocean, which means that rivers quite often run together, but they very rarely fork apart. deltas, like the Nile Delta, where the Nile actually forks apart and runs into the Mediterranean in several different places, are more of an exception than the general rule. And that's pretty much it when it comes to rivers. Now let's go to mountains. Generally, mountains are more or less shaped in a line. So you won't have mountains that are shaped as a star, for instance. The line can be slightly crooked. It might even be hook-shaped in some ways. But it is often, nearly always, some sort of line. And these mountain ranges very often run parallel to the coast and are close to the coast. Not always, but often. Why? Because of tectonic plates that are pushing together, and one plate is pushed down, forming the seabed and the seafloor, and the other plate is pushed upwards and is forming the mountain, which is, of course, not that far from the coast, because, yeah, that's where the plates meet, so to speak. Another thing about mountains, which we will be talking about in a second, is mountains can be great borders for climates, but we'll come to that soon. Now climates. Let's talk about climates. In our world and in most fantasy worlds, climates happen latitude-wise. So if you take a look at North America and Europe, even though those two continents are quite far apart, the similar latitudes on both continents have a similar climate. So you have basically starting from cold, and the further you get to the equator, the warmer it becomes, the more lush and maybe jungle-like the area can become. Unless there is some sort of strong magic involved, you will very rarely find a jungle high up in the north. Now, you should also never put obviously different terrains next to each other. For instance, a jungle will not border a desert unless there is some sort of in-between area to divide them, like for instance mountains or grassy plains. Or there is, again, as I said, a strong magical effect to make it possible. Mountain ranges can be very effective if you want to divide your climate, because rain comes from a specific direction, and most continents have rain coming most of the time from a specific direction, and then it runs into the mountains. And often the rain cannot go above the mountains, so it stops, the clouds stop there, and the rain falls on this side of the mountain. Now, this side of the mountain, which is usually the side that is more coastal, but not always, is lush. It gets a lot of rain. It might have a large forest or something growing there. The other side of the mountain can be quite dry, even though the mountain range itself doesn't necessarily have to be massive. As long as it's high enough, it can be a great border between two fairly different climates. Now that you've done mountains and rivers and thought about climate for a little, you can start adding hills and forests and lakes and things like that to your map. Don't think about them too much. Just put them wherever they seem fit. What I do with lakes especially is if I have a corner of the map where there's no rivers and I know, okay, I might want a civilization there, then put a lake there. And voila, you have a freshwater problem that has gone away. Hills and forests, put them wherever you want. Obviously, forests are not in very, very dry circumstances, but wherever you want them, put them down there, pretty much. And now that you've done all that, you can add all your weird fantasy stuff. The contrast to the normal, to the realistic stuff. Maybe you have floating mountains, you have forests of fire, you have rivers flowing uphill, and all these things that will seem even more dramatic and fantastical because of the contrast, as I said. And once you have done that, now the map is mostly finished when it comes to geography, and now it is time to add your civilizations, your realms. When you do that, when you add nations, make sure that you do not cover the whole map in nations. Always leave the untamed lands, the wild lands, a stretch of land that is claimed by no crown, because you will need them in your adventures. Your player characters might be keen on building a small realm for themselves and There is no better way to do this than in the dangerous, untamed wildlands, which is at the same time also a great breeding ground for monsters. And you don't have to think about an explanation why the local king has not exterminated the monsters that are attacking him. Because the wildlands are beyond the reach of his armies, and that's where the monsters are coming from. And only a major campaign would manage to get there and attack the monsters at their point of origin as such. Now, when you are creating realms, you usually start with creating cities. Looking at your map, place cities, as I said before, along rivers, especially river mouths, where the river runs into an ocean or a sea. You will see that a lot of our large cities, or nearly every major river mouth, say in Europe, has a medium-sized to large city there. That's a very prime spot for civilizations. Then, once you have filled up all the rivers, so to speak, with cities, you can move over to defensible positions, maybe flat mountain ranges or mountain passes that can be only accessed really from one side. That's another great location for potential cities. And then once you have taken the rivers and the natural defenses and filled all them up, then you can move over to things like resources or trade routes. For instance, a very rich mine might very well make a city spring up around it, even though there might not be that much fresh water, which would have to be transported in from the distance, but the mine makes it worthwhile, so to speak. Or, as I said, trade routes between two major cities might spawn a smaller city in between or a town in between. Then, once you have put down all your cities, you use pretty much the same rules, only at a smaller scale, for towns and for villages if you so desire. And then you can add things like fortresses and similar things where they make sense on the map. Fortresses, for instance, you would add along borders, you will add them next to important roads, you will add them on coastlines to protect from pirates and similar outlaws or threats coming from the sea. Now, you might feel a little overwhelmed at the moment, thinking, okay, I need to come up with like 50 different landscapes and cities for my map, and then I have to give them all names, and then when my players see them on the map, they will ask, oh, what's that city, what's there? And I will be pressed to basically describe every little location, every little name that I have put on the map in more or less detail. Now, that's not correct. Technically, you do not really need to do that. Ideally, yes, you would have to put at least, let's say, a half a sentence or a sentence next to every major geographical location on your map. Say, for instance, you have a forest, and next to that forest you could write, well, not on the map, obviously, but wherever you keep in your notes, you could write, infested with bandits, usually quite dry. That could be simple enough. That could be enough for it. And really, the only thing that you need to fill out in more detail are the cities and the geographical locations which are close to your player characters. And then don't worry if your player characters ask around about specific locations, because the further away these locations are, the less likely it is that we'll find someone who actually knows things about that location. So you can tell them whatever you want, really. You can tell them outright things that are outright wrong, and then just retcon them and change them further on. And there's such a large chance of someone they talk to who might only know legends about a specific place, and those legends can be completely made up. The further away something is, the more likely it is that people have no idea of what's really there. And yet, travel in a fantasy world is usually tricky and usually dangerous. So knowledge about faraway places, and because there's no internet, is not spread very correctly and not spread very quickly. And now that was our map video. Let me know what you think. Let me know what kind of ideas you have for your own maps and kind of processes you go through in your head when you are creating your own maps. If you have specific programs that you follow, or if you have specific softwares that you use, I'd be very interested in hearing about it. As always, if you liked our content, feel free to subscribe to the channel. We'll be running a lot of the adventures and some more GM musings and other things in the future. And until we see each other again, good luck with your own games, and I will see you on the internet.